side. And it's silly of you if you don't see the slides, because although I am the attraction, the slides are an important part. So why don't you move? As many of you know, you have in front of you, at this point in time, a depressed man with a smiling face. I'm depressed because I have worked for more than 40 years to save the world from overpopulation, from overpollution, from over-resource use, without very much effect. Most of my hard struggle has been in vain. And this is most easily seen by the fact that the world today is less sustainable than it was in 1970 when I started working on these issues. However, I'm still smiling. And I'm smiling for several reasons. I'm smiling, first of all, because of all the learning these 45 years have bestowed on me. I'm a much wiser man at this point in time than in 1970. As of today, I have made, I think, 8 attempts. So I corrected this from yesterday, 7 to 8 today. I've made 8 efforts at trying to save the world. They have all failed, but each time I've learned something. And the good thing is that each time I've finished one way in vain of saving the world, I have one more lesson to add to my wonderful list of lessons on how not to save the world. And the wonderful thing with my psychology, and I presume that Peter is going to talk more about that part of the world, the soft part, I'm the rationalist, is that each time I'm through with one attempt, I'm totally convinced that now I know how to do it. You know, so I've tried, it failed, and I say, Jesus, I know why it failed. Aha, this time. And so we are proceeding, and I am smiling. I'm also smiling for a third reason, and that is that in retrospect, I'm now 73. You know, I have had quite a few instances of incredible luck, which has nothing to do with skill, nothing to do with personality, nothing. It's just being at the right time, at the right place. And so serendipity is part of this. Finally, in order to please Bob, you know, I've passed this talk through him several times, so that I think I'm closer to talking about what he would like me to talk about, because he would like me to talk about models. You know, how models enhance your ability to change people. So I am admitting the fact that I have used models in most of these 8 attempts. And the conclusions that I draw from this are many modeling conclusions that I would like the modelers among you to take note of. But you will see that as the decades passed and I proved unable to change the world, you know, the conclusions started to become more airy. They're more social science, they're more psychology, they're more political. So the rest of the audience might want to think about those conclusions, because they might have the stronger impact on their own thinking. Good. As a starting point, it's worth pointing out that the message that I have been trying to communicate, and try to communicate in such a manner that people actually start acting differently after having received the communication, that the message I'm trying to get across is not particularly difficult. It's actually very simple. In model terms, it is as simple as this. You know, average well-being for the ordinary citizen of the world is influenced by 2 things. At least, it's the physical output, the consumption per person, and it's the environment in which the person lives. So the higher the consumption, the happier people are, all else equal, and the worse the environment is, the less happy the person is, all else equal. And then it is the fact that the output per person has something to do with the productive capacity of the world economy, and it has to do with the size of the population. It's the ratio between the two, which tells how much is available for each of us, and that leads to well-being. On the other hand, if that capacity is used to produce goods and services, which is what it is being used for, you know, there is a certain pollution output and a certain resource use with each unit of production or consumption, and the sum, you know, adds up into the human footprint. And when the human footprint, the human resource use and human pollution output starts to approach the limitations of the planet, we start to get problems, environmental damage, and higher environmental damage, you know, less clean air, less clean water, biodiversity decline, global warming. The more there is of this, the lower is the well-being. And the message that we have been trying to convey, or I have been trying to convey with many other people, of course, is then easily illustrated in dynamic terms. So what is happening is that the population is growing, the output is growing, as a consequence the environmental damage is increasing, and after a while the environmental damage is increasing faster than the output, and the well-being starts to decline. And this is the picture I've been trying to tell people about. And then I have added that it is kind of silly to live through that decline in well-being in the far future. So in other words, why don't we start to think about what we could do in order to avoid the environmental damage? And that's the message. Very simple and totally impossible to get across, is my conclusion. And now I will go through the 8 attempts that I have done this far, and try to teach you what can be learned from all of this. So the first attempt has to do with the book, The Limits to Growth. I was so lucky, I arrived at MIT in January, or at the System Dynamics group of MIT, just in a couple of weeks before Forrester came back with the money from the Club of Rome to start the Limits to Growth project. And since I was paid for by the Norwegian government, I was free labor and was pulled by Dennis into this project. And then that determined the rest of my life, because I then suddenly understood that the world is small, that it is necessary to do something today in order to reduce population growth and reduce the ecological footprint. And we went on to write this into a lucid model, the World Tree model, and the very well-written book, The Limits to Growth, which unbelievably sold 9 million copies in 36 languages. And so one cannot complain that we were not heard. You know, certainly we were heard. And the message was described as clearly as Dana Meadows could describe the problem, and that's very clear. So there was no problem on that score. We did have some good effect in the early 1970s out of the Limits to Growth. It did help the green movement establish itself and have some kind of Bible that could be used as its foundations, but it did not lead to a mass movement of any kind. Rather to the opposite. I think the success of the Limits to Growth model and book actually solidified the opposition against no growth thinking. So it really strengthened the enemy more than it did strengthen our movement. And so the conclusion, fine. So the conclusion I reached from the first study is that it certainly is not enough to tell people what your model says, especially if the model advice differs from what people want to hear. And that's a very, very, very important conclusion for model makers. You know, it certainly does not help to tell people that you ought to have fewer children and you ought to stop consuming things that produce a lot of pollution and acquires a lot of resources, when those two things are exactly the things they want to do. What next? I spent 5 years of my life trying to spread the gospel. And then I stopped doing that in that manner, and I asked the question, you know, what can I learn? What can I do next? What is the second attempt? And the second attempt, I then concluded from the first one that what was necessary is to make the audience understand better what are the long-term negative consequences of continuing business as usual. And so I chose to do this by going from the global scale down to the national scale in Scandinavia, Norway, and from the world economy to industrial sectors, and particularly industrial sectors that had a resource footprint. So the wood industry, the hydropower industry, the oil and gas industry. And we did, I started something called the Resource Policy Group, a Futures Research Institute or a Policy Analysis Institute, and we did studies showing how current industrial policy would lead to problems in the individual sectors over the next, call it 10 to 30 years. So we have gotten the time horizon down and the scope down. And the interesting thing I also understood at that time, with particularly the help of Karsten, who is here, that one important point in order to make people understand was that they would have to participate in the building of these models that were used to analyze the long-term consequences in industrial sectors. So we formed the first attempts of real group model building with, you know, business owners, labor union people, politicians, bureaucrats, the whole schmear. And we learned from all of this that, yes, number 2, you know, if you want model to love your model and to understand its unconventional and counterintuitive conclusions, they must participate in the construction of the model. It actually does work, you know, to sit down with the users and make the model. Sorry, now my timer goes off. Okay. It actually does help, you know, to have them join in. The problem was that whereas the 10 people involved in each of those studies were ecstatic about the analysis and firmly believed the conclusions, that didn't transfer very well to the, at that time, 3.5 million Norwegians. You know, so they were enthusiastic like we were, but of course it didn't lead to mass action because these were the few guys that believed that this was of interest, and they of course didn't have the power single-handedly to implement. In addition, each of these analyses cost $500,000 in current terms. And so you couldn't repeat it, you know, educating 10 people at $500,000 was kind of expensive grown-up education. So this did not work. What did I learn from that? Well, I learned that what you need to do is to try to produce a signal, some kind of report, output, something that would trigger a lot of action among a lot of people everywhere else. You know, so that you didn't have to get involved in actually convincing each of them at $500,000 per 10 persons. We did that, and we chose to do this in the following manner. We started going into sectors where we did make long-term forecasts. So where we were basically saying that if you are in shipping, you know, you if you look at the short term, that's one matter, but if you look at the long-term consequences of your investment behavior or over your employment of your ships, there are problems out there, and your profits will be lower if you do what you would conventionally do than if you do something else. And then we marketed these things into the whole shipping community in the hope that they would then follow suit. And we did this in real estate, we did it in a number of other sectors, to see whether it's possible to send out a central signal, basically, and then get independent action. And the interesting thing we learned from this is lesson number 3. It is that most people feel forced to follow the conventional wisdom of their surroundings, even when they know they could have benefited from following your model advice. And what does this say? It says that when we finally manage to convince a ship owner to sell at the proper time, that's the time when everyone else buys. He would discuss this in cocktail parties and elsewhere, and everyone else would say, "You're crazy. I mean, these are the this is the time of the upturn. You cannot sell now." And normally we then experience that most people aren't strong enough to stand against the conventional wisdom of their surroundings. And that's useful to know. And so at that point in time, I learned that it is not enough to tell people what is needed, that it is too expensive to try to teach all of them what it would take, and that even in the case where you get through to people, you are up against the total ignorance of the conventional wisdom. So, we didn't get through in those 3 ways. New conviction. So, what to do? I've learned those 3 things. Again, luck. A rich man in Norway called one day and said, "Would you like to be the managing director of my fortune? I'm a wealthy man, and I would like to make the following point, that capitalism can actually save the world through profitable investments. So I give you all my money, and you have the task of solving the green problem, the social problems, the equity, the gender problem, etc. The only requirement is that don't lose the money. I don't need a high return, but I want the money back." So this is the benevolent capitalist volunteer, who says that let us save the world using the existing system. I spent 3 years doing green investments to save the world. And that was more than enough to reach the number lesson 4, which no one understands, accepts even at this point in time, as being the most important lesson learned. Namely, that what society needs most, for instance, reduced emissions, is not what is most profitable in the investor perspective. In other words, it is more profitable to let the world go to hell than it is to make the investments that are necessary in order to avoid making the world go to hell. So what is, and this is totally obvious, what needs to be done today is that instead of investing in coal, oil and gas utilities, we should put money into the more expensive wind, sun, etc. And that's the same today as it was at the time. And this is, of course, a totally important thing for most people to understand, that the reason why nothing happens is that what in the area that I'm interested in is, of course, because it is less profitable. In some cases it is profitable, but it's less profitable than doing what they currently do. And this is a real obstacle. So private money will not solve the problem, was my lesson number 4. So then it started to become difficult. This is already 25 years ago, and you can wonder how in the world have I stood on my feet, all the time until now. I just have to put on the machine again. I learned from this that something which is illustrated by this indicator. This is the Living Planet Index, which I invented with my friends in WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, in Geneva in 1995. We started publishing this indicator which measures the amount of animals that are left, plants that are left, fish that are left. So it's a vertebrate species index, just showing how man is very quickly reducing the biodiversity of the globe. I got the job so I moved from private money to then trying to say, okay, so if the private sector can't do it, we need to do it through politics. In order to do something in politics, we need a big following, so we need to start organizing masses of people into pressure groups. NGOs is the popular word. So I chose nature conservation. WWF had at the time 5 million members in the Western world. We thought that that's a pretty big and effective starting point. We spoke before Norway in the UN negotiations, because in UN conversations you speak according to size. So we felt that we had a position where we could do something. We tried desperately to get 10 million people to pay the $25 a year it takes to be a member of WWF. We couldn't do it. And so the WWF has still only 5 million members, 25 years down the line, which taught me one thing, that the number of people who actually wants to do something in order to make a better world is surprisingly small, compared to the total population. 5 million members is only 1%. But what I did learn from all of this, which is important for those of you who would like to muster public engagement in things, is that to focus public attention on a slowly emerging problem, it helps to establish a quantitative performance indicator which is updated annually with great fanfare. The only problem is that you must at least do this for 10 years before it has any type of impact. The ecological footprint, which was the sister indicator of the Living Planet Index, is of course now the type of gold standard concerning footprint measurements. So I learned from this how difficult it is to gather a big following. And I basically gave up. That was the time when I gave up and said, to hell with it. If people are so stupid as they are, let them be so stupid and create a horrible. Then 5 years later, the Prime Minister of Norway called and he said, Jorgen, I would like you to chair a commission that is to make the plan for how Norway can reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 by 2050. This was in 2005, and he said, would you like to take the job? And I said, this is like a dream. How in the world can you think I would say no? So I said yes. My commission worked for 18 months. We made a wonderful 15-point plan for how Norway could cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 63% by 2050. It was based on a model, it was quantified, and we had chosen 15 things that are relatively simple for Parliament to pass. We handed it in and thought that we would be celebrated like heroes. This was a unanimous, 10-man commission report. So what happened was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I spent 4 years of my life then traveling Norway trying to convince Norwegians that this is a great deal. Why aren't you in favor of these 15 things? Particularly when the total cost of those things amounts to $200, $300 per person per year. So it's the same in Norway as increasing the income tax from 33%, which is the average, to 34%. That would finance the whole 15 measures and make Norway a leading nation in the decline in greenhouse gas emissions. And the lesson from having, having spent up to 2010 on this is the following. That most people, or at least rich Norwegians, are not willing to spend money or to restructure the economy. That means to change jobs today in order to obtain an uncertain benefit for their children or grandchildren in 30 years. Sad fact. You know, they would much rather have the $300 for going shopping a weekend in London, which is what most Norwegians do on their marginal income, than paying it to Jorgen in order to create a better future. A hard blow, and then I really gave up. You know, this was in 2011, and then I decided to do something which was pretty smart in retrospect. So I wrote this book, and this book is a forecast of what will happen in the world when you do not follow Jorgen's advice. So this is what you stupid assholes, you know, as individuals, as corporations, as nations, and the world. This is what will happen when you continue using your decision rules, you know, your normal way of facing a problem. And that's what I did. I spent time warning people about the future they were about to create for themselves. When I had done this for a while and made a lot of money on royalties and even more on speaking engagements, this proved to be one way of securing my pension, so I can continue working, you know, for saving the world in the future, along with the money I made with the green investment stuff. You know, so that's this is important. If you want to save the world, you need independent income. You need a salary, and you need a salary when you get old. So please save while you're young, so that you can save the world when you're old. This helped. The interest of this thing, it sold in 150,000 copies in 10 languages, and the money flowed in, and I traveled the world and gave talks about this. And the lesson learned from this is interesting. It is that one cannot scare people into action by telling them ahead of time what sad future will result from continuation of their current behavior. Because what was the result of this report? This report basically says that over the next 40 years, population will become bigger, economy will become bigger, you know, there will be some action to try to reduce some of the worst climate emissions, but not enough. So in 2050, the temperature will be +2 degrees, and then later in the century, it will be even higher. There won't be any collapses. It's just a sadder and sadder and sadder world. That's what the report says. The response was, among ecologists and environmentalists, my friends, is that they hated this book because it did not forecast collapse, catastrophe, and the greenies, including myself, at some point in time believe that catastrophe is actually what triggers action. We know now that it doesn't, but they didn't like the book of this, and everyone else didn't like the book because they said, I don't believe that world society is so stupid that they would allow this to happen slowly, you know, in a way. So they basically said that someone is going to, you know, decide to act differently, or technology will come and solve the problem. So it didn't trigger any type of action. One of the interesting things of this round of presentations to an unwilling audience about what will happen is that people ask me, so what should be done? And I said, I won't tell you, because nothing will be done. And consequently, you are wasting my time and I am wasting your time if we discuss these hypothetical things that ought to be done in order to save the world. And they said, please, Mr. Randers, please tell us what should be done. You know, what is the program to save the world? And after 5 years of this, I ended up having a slide which showed the 5 things that needs to be done. You know, stop using fossil fuels, stop having more than one child, shorten the work year so that production does not increase, a couple of things like this. And people said, are you crazy? You think that these things will happen? And I said, no, these things will not happen. You just insisted wasting my time and your time. and this was interesting, and in the end, you know, we had done this so long, that we wrote a book, a friend and I, which is our, so the 8th attempt, was smart sustainability policy for the rich world. So what we said, okay, what is needed are policies that give a short-term advantage to a majority of the voters, and that's what they vote for. And then in addition, these policies must solve the problem in the long term. So a typical example, we need electric cars in the long run. How do you make people buy the more expensive electric cars? You allow them to drive in the bus-only lane. So then people start buying electric cars, not because they're concerned about the environment and the long term, but because they would like to drive in the bus-only lane. So that's the type. So we wrote a book called Reinventing Prosperity, How to Solve Unemployment Inequity and the Climate Change in the Rich World. 15, another list, actually was 12 this time. And marketed, and it didn't sell at all. So that's it. So what did we learn from this? We learned from this that lesson 8. There is not necessarily a majority support for strong action, even if it gives benefits to many in the short term and solves the underlying problem in the long run. Which is a sobering effect. Let me give you the best example of this. One of the, or many of our proposals involve redistribution, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, or taking from the rich giving to the state, so the state can provide social services for the majority. And the interesting thing, and we said that the way to do this is to tax the 10%, and then 90% ought to be in favor of this. That's even in social democratic Norway, there is a majority against this. They don't want higher tax levels because when we get rich, we are not going to be paying for that fat ass, sitting there on the corner. And so even things that really would have helped does not have, at least in our country and for sure in the United States, a majority behind it. So finally, my final conviction, at this point in time, and that's where I am now, we are on the next slide. My new conviction is that you must force people to do this. And democracy does not work. Then, smart as I am and old as I am, I'm then looking around to see whether there is someone out there who has power and is moving in the right direction. And of course there is President Xi and the Communist Party of China, which are doing all the correct things at great speed and in the right direction. So currently I'm helping them, planning the green transition in China to 2050. President Xi has not only said, but it is now built into the constitution of China, that by 2025 the urban air is going to be clean. By 2030, China will be a moderately affluent society. By 2050, we will have 0 greenhouse gas emissions from China and much more even income distribution. These are basically the things that needs to happen in order to make me happy. We are making the plans to do so in the Prime Minister's office, and let us see. So that's the end of the story. Will this thing work? I'm totally convinced that it will work. And if it does not, I will have a 9th lesson and be clear for my 10th attempt.